Well, the core of manipulation techniques is to acquire power and control over another, to influence others to one's own advantage. And today we're learning how to identify such behavior in a relationship. Dr. Arlene Powell is joining us from the Centers for Sexual Health to discuss part one of this segment.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Whitney.
Thank you for being here.
Thank
Let's get
you.
into these manipulation tactics. There are 5 we want to discuss today, and we have more we'll be talking about in other segments.
Yes.
But let's talk about gaslighting. That's one I've heard of before.
Yeah, that one's pretty popular.
Yeah.
Gaslighting came from a 1944 movie starring Ingrid Bergman, if anyone remembers, where the husband tried to convince her that she was losing her mind and that she was crazy so that he could take over her wealthy inheritance that he wanted. And that's the idea. Gaslighting means when someone is going to gain power and control. Those are your two key components and the reasons for manipulating, by convincing them that something's wrong with them. They're mentally ill, like they'll say you're depressed, convince them they're crazy, convince them they're forgetful, convince them they're drunk, convince them something's wrong with them, otherwise irrational. So the person begins to doubt their own senses and listens to the manipulator so that they lose power of their own lives and their own sense of security and their own values and start believing in the other person, which gives them complete control over them.
Another one that comes up in topics often is projection. You know, you often say that person's projecting their own
Projection,
feelings.
good old Freud. That's a really old defense mechanism that Freud put out in psychoanalysis. And the idea is that you take your own ideas, beliefs, and thoughts and you project them onto the other person. So for example, someone might say, who's very selfish or perhaps narcissistic, "You're so selfish. You only think about yourself." Because that's, of course, what they do. By telling you that, the person, of course, gets very defensive and they start, oh my gosh, what am I doing? They pull back, they stop asserting themselves, they start to doubt themselves. Again, once you insert doubt and insecurity in another person, the other one gains power and control.
And the boomerang, I hadn't heard of this one. What is the boomerang?
A boomerang is exactly what it sounds like. When you throw out a boomerang, what happens? It goes right around and comes back and hits it flat back on. A boomerang is when you will say something and the other person throws it back and blames you for the very same thing. So if you think about it, this probably happened to everybody a lot. So you'll say, you try to be very nice, and you say to your partner, you know, I'm really feeling kind of lonely. I'd really like a little more affection. That would be great. And in this case, he, of course, this goes both ways. And he says, but you never do that for me. I never get that. You're always ignoring me. We never have sex, right? So whenever you say, and the other person goes, oh, so all of a sudden, if you're in a conversation and you notice that rather than asking a person for your needs, you find yourself getting defensive, they probably used a boomerang.
And then redirecting and changing the subject is similar to a boomerang?
No, redirecting and changing the subject is an abrupt cutoff. Bam.
Okay.
They end the topic. So the person talking, you know, I'm trying to make an impression and I'm talking at a party and I want people to pay attention to me. They shift it. They take the tension off of you so you don't get reinforcement from other people. You get the attention back on the manipulator. So for example, they'll say, well, anyway, right when you're telling your point of your story,
Right.
Or they'll say, well, that may be but, change the topic. Or, well, when that happened to me, pull the attention back to themselves and let you be ignored.
And the last one, judging or criticizing to make you feel inadequate.
That one sounds obvious. You know, you're being judgmental, you're being critical, but actually it's very often passive aggressive. It's very subtle. It's not as obvious as you would think. So for example, you know, your partner brings you, look what I did, isn't this great? And they go, yeah, that's really nice. And you know what I'd do if I were you? Or here's a better way to do it. Or if you ever thought about this, or well, yeah, that's great, good for you. Oh, by the way, so they can either redirect it or they could just put it down, but they criticize it or they judge it, and somehow there's a little hint in there, you're not good enough. And then you'll notice this when you feel like no matter what I do, no matter how hard I try, it's never enough, it's never good enough, and I can't please you. That's what's going to happen. All these techniques, though, overall, are going to leave you feeling less than, right? They leave the person who might have been very strong and very confident with a good sense of self feeling very insecure, very unconfident, quiet, withdrawn. And if you start noticing that you're getting, my bottom line kind of is if you feel anxious, depressed, insecure, lonely, and with another partner, there's a flag. You need to start paying attention. All of us do some of these techniques sometime accidentally, but if it's continual, you start losing your sense of self, you start getting depressed or anxious, you're uncomfortable with your own identity in their presence. I want you to pay attention.
It's a red flag. All right, well, thank you so much for being here. Be sure to tune in for our next segment. We'll discuss 5 more manipulation techniques. And the following segment, we will talk about how to detect, avoid, and block them.